During the early 90s, SEGA was looking for every way to prolong the SEGA Genesis's life cycle via attachments for the SEGA Genesis. Of course, the first attachment released for the SEGA Genesis was the SEGA CD, which allowed for full motion video and CD quality audio to be played on your SEGA Genesis. But towards the end of the SEGA Genesis's life cycle, SEGA wanted one more chance to prolong the system because the SEGA Saturn wasn't quite ready to come out yet. So to do this, they released something called the SEGA 32X, which was yet another attachment for the SEGA Genesis. But whereas the SEGA CD was a CD-based system, the SEGA 32X was actually a cartridge-based system that was touted as a 32-bit experience. And unfortunately, it was not met with good critiques and it ultimately failed in the long run. Only about 40 games released for the system. But I actually own a complete library of 32X games and I'm a big fan of the system. I thought it just never had a proper chance to shine because there were some games on there that really showed what the 32X was capable of. Even though it used the Genesis's audio chip, some of the graphics on the 32X were pretty impressive, and there's actually one case of pretty impressive audio as well. So today on Hardware Pushers, we're going to spotlight the 32X. We're going to give the 32X a chance to shine, and maybe you'll learn about some pretty cool 32X games you never played. So sit back, relax, subscribe, and let's talk about some SEGA 32X Hardware Pushers.
Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32X.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power of your 40 times.
Thank you.
So the first game we're going to take a look at is a 32X exclusive 2D platformer called Tempo. Now, I think it's pretty easy to see why Tempo has made this list of hardware pushers because it's a gorgeous looking game, definitely something that could not have been done on 16-bit systems, whether it's the environments, all of the stuff going on in the foreground or the background. The color palette is very bright and varied, and of course Tempo himself is animated just so beautifully. It reminds me a lot of an early 90s cartoon sort of thing. It looks like something that would have been on television. It's a really visually impressive game. There's lots of scaling going on as well, as you'll see here with this boss fight. Just a visually impressive game and definitely something that was unique to the 32X and a really good hardware pusher in my opinion. Knuckles Chaotix is sort of an indecisive game. Some people really like it, some people not so much. Me personally though, I am a fan of this game and I think it's deserving of a spot on hardware pushers. The audio was pretty much the same as you would see in something like a 16-bit Sonic game, but the character scaling is what really made this game unique. You had these big, beautiful characters that would scale based on different power-ups you would pick up. There was an interesting ring mechanic, and the 3D stages were really done beautifully in my opinion as well. Definitely something that I don't think the SEGA Genesis could have pulled off. You see there's some polygons going on as well, some really good scaling, but the most impressive thing to me are some of the boss fights in this game. I think a lot of people who sort of write this game off haven't experienced some of these boss fights because there's a lot of interesting mechanics going on within them. Lots of scaling, lots of foreground and background stuff, sort of pseudo 3D environmental effects as well, and you could see the characters scaling back and forth and whatnot. Just a really fun game and definitely a underrated game in my opinion in the Sonic universe. NBA Jam Tournament Edition was on a plethora of systems, so I'm sure you're thinking, why is this on an episode of Hardware Pushers? You kind of have to be a big fan of NBA Jam to see why though, but the 32X edition of NBA Jam Tournament Edition was actually very impressive simply because of the scaling of the game. Scaling was a very big thing for the 32X, and this was one of the only cartridge versions that featured full scaling of the character models. You could see as they get closer to the camera, the character models get bigger. The character models were also more detailed than other versions of the game, and it's just a very solid version of the game, but the scaling really helps set it apart as far as a hardware pusher on this list because it's pretty impressive to see the 32X pulling that off. Not all games on this list are simply graphical based. Let's take a look at Metalhead, which is going to be on this list for audio.
To maintain public order, a powered bipedal armed robot, or Metalhead, was created by the International Special Armed Forces, part of the Federation Police.
Not only was that song really cool, but obviously it was included because of the full voice acting in the intro of the game. As far as the game is concerned itself, it's a standard 3D mech shooting game, but there is some nice stuff going on. The graphics are big and colorful, and it's a solid game as well. It's definitely deserving of a spot on the list for the smooth 3D engine in this game. Another game that's going to be a bit polarizing on this list, I feel, is the 32X version of Doom. Now, the 32X used the SEGA Genesis sound chip, so unfortunately a lot of games did not have enhanced audio, but as far as the visuals are concerned, they're pretty decent, and honestly it runs better than the 3DO version of the game. Doom on the 32X features a pretty decent sized screen. It is cropped, but it's very smooth, it's very fluid, and definitely a very playable version of Doom. It definitely has a bigger screen size than the Super Nintendo version. It runs a lot smoother as well, so I'm fine with putting Doom on this list. Star Wars Arcade on the 32X was the first 32X game I ever owned as a kid and left a lasting impression on me. It's a fantastic version of the Sega re-release arcade game, and you could definitely see why. We're sort of getting into the 3D games on this list, and it's a really solid game. Very fluid. The frame rate maybe not as smooth as it could have been, but definitely a lot of polygons, a lot of stuff going on screen, a lot of explosions, and just a very smooth, fluid engine. And I think that's the big thing with Star Wars Arcade is this could not have been done on a Sega Genesis. This could not have been done on a Super Nintendo. Sure, you had Star Fox with the Super FX chip, but I think this looks way better. There's way more colors, there's way more stuff going on. It's definitely much more fluid in terms of frame rate than Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, so definitely a deserving game on this list. I love this scene with the Death Star right here, just very ominous and very foreboding. So a super cool game as well. Star Wars 32X, definitely a hardware pusher. Now, arguably, this is the most visually impressive game on the 32X, Virtua Racing Deluxe for the 32X. This, of course, was based on the awesome arcade game released by Sega before Daytona USA, and Virtua Racing Deluxe on the 32X is just a technical marvel in my opinion. You have such a fluid 3D engine running, and yeah, you know, there's pop-up and stuff, but you have to think back to when this game was released. When you look at Virtua Racing on the SEGA Genesis, it doesn't hold a candle to this. This has bigger polygons, it has a much smoother and faster frame rate, the racing action is very tight, and the scaling on the game is very well done as well. It's just a very visually impressive game that just flows beautifully. I think this was really a litmus test for the 32X, and it sort of showed what could have been if companies hadn't abandoned it so soon, because this is just an amazing port of an arcade game. It's fast, it's fun, it's fluid, and it's a game that every 32X owner should own, in my opinion, because it's a true hardware pusher in every sense of the word. 3D racing games were definitely in their infancy in this stage, and this game has really stood the test of time in terms of gameplay. So Virtua Racing Deluxe on the 32X, an absolute hardware pusher, probably the best looking game on this list, but I think we all know what's going to be my final game for this system. Virtua Fighter 32X, in my opinion, is the best hardware pusher because it is a 3D fighting game playing essentially on an add-on for the Sega Genesis, and this is an awesome version of the game. It's actually arguably better than the original Saturn version in terms of gameplay, and the graphics are just so good. This was another litmus test for the 32X, a sort of sign of what could have been if companies had put the time and effort into the system. It's a solid arcade port considering it was a pretty mid-release in the 32X's absolutely short life cycle, it's really a sign of things that could have been. I think the 32X could have been a lot more, and games like this and Virtua Racing Deluxe just prove it in my opinion. An absolute hardware pusher, an absolute fantastic fighting game, and my favorite 32X game of all time.
So those are the games that I feel really pushed the SEGA 32X hardware pretty much to its limits. There's one or two more games I could have included on the list, such as Colibri, which was an interesting 2D hummingbird-based shooter that ran at 60 frames per second, and Shadow Squadron, which was another 3D-based space shooter. But I felt these games were pretty much the cream of the crop on the system in terms of pushing graphics or pushing audio. Not necessarily the best games on the system, because if they were, Colibri definitely would have been on the list, but very impressive games in terms of visuals. When you look at a game like Virtua Racing Deluxe and Virtua Fighter 32X, you could really see what the 32X was capable of, and it's just a shame that it never had a chance to reach its full capabilities, because who knows, it may have ended up being a complete success, but maybe Sega should have released it as its own system instead of an add-on for the Sega Genesis. Did you ever own a 32X? Do you currently own a 32X? And if not, what do you think of the 32X? What do you think of the games that I've shown? Let me know in the comments section down below. Tell me some of your favorite 32X memories if you have some, and thank you for checking out this video. As always, make sure you subscribe to the channel, make sure you leave me a comment and like the video, and if you really like me, check out all the links in the description box down below. We've got social media, we've got Patreon, we've got t-shirts. Stay up to date in the world of everything RGT 85, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. I think I'm gonna go play some more 32X. Later.
RGT!